it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Frank Forkin, Ipsos's automotive sector client leader. Frank, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. First, I wanted to welcome everybody again. This is our third automotive summit around our Navigator program, as well as information we're collecting on a regular basis around COVID and how it's impacting our industry. So Mike, why don't you just, first of all, let me introduce, I think most of you have been looking at who's registered, have been to some of our previous webcasts. But again, Mike Van Newkirk and John Kaiser will be presenting the bulk of the information. I'll be providing color commentary as we go through. But before we do that, I want to kind of just give you a little bit of information on where all this information is coming from. So Mike, if you could move the slide forward. One more. Okay, go ahead, Mike, one more. So the bulk of the study of the results are coming from 3 different sources. I want to make sure you guys are aware of them. One of them is Ipsos runs a weekly tracker called Essentials around what's going on in COVID, and not only COVID, but other things that are happening right now and how it's affecting just kind of customer behavior. And so we actually have the opportunity to add questions that are auto-related. So Mike's going to be using some of that information we get from those reports. And then John runs a syndicated study called the Mobility Navigator, broken up, as you can see on the right, into 3 different modules. We've already talked about the autonomous and connected car module. And then last couple months ago, we talked about the electrification module. And this is the final module, which is focused more on mobility. So the first part's going to be around kind of some of the COVID things we're learning, and then John's going to focus strictly on some of the mobility issues. So Mike, if you could go one more slide, because we've added something new to this last webcast. I had the opportunity to hear some of the things that our government group was doing. And one of the things, a new tool that they have is something they call Biosurveillance Atlas, which some of you may have seen. It's kind of like, imagine a density map where you can see things like over time, how traffic flow might be changing from a certain period to the next. Now, they use a lot of it to kind of just understand, the COVID rates and things like that. But we're going to actually apply that to mobility. And Mike's going to show you some slides on how things have changed from pre-COVID to now, on who's using public transportation and kind of where it differs throughout the country. So I'm excited about that, and again, something I think really shows how the pandemic is impacting our world. So with that, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you, let you guys do your show, and it's all yours.
Okay, great. I think we're all just going to go ahead and turn the cameras off now. That way the screen will be hopefully nice and large for all of you. And as Frank mentioned, I'm going to start with a little bit of information that we've been following over the course of the year related to COVID-19 and its impact on U.S. consumers in general. And I'm going to transition a bit of that talk and as we move through that into its impact on some of the mobility services and even people driving their own vehicles and how things have shifted over time. So let's see if this is moving forward. Hold on. There we go. All right, so let's start with something I think we're all very familiar with and certainly dealing with right now, and that is the resurgence of the number of COVID cases that are being reported in the United States. We saw a bit of a bump up in July, and then it kind of leveled off as the summer wore on, and things were starting to look like we were headed in the right direction. But then October into November hit, and continuing on, we saw this steep increase in the number of reported cases. And I'm sharing this not because this is something new to any of you, but I wanted to use this as sort of a platform or a background from some of the information I'm going to share with you moving forward. And one way that I'm going to sort of relate the two is by sharing with you what we call the IPAC model, which is our Ipsos Pandemic Adaptability Continuum model. It's really a process or a methodology that we've developed that looks at how U.S. consumers or consumers in even other markets are dealing with COVID-19. And the way it sets up is there's 10 phases or stages within this model. Everything from the early stages when there's a lot of uncertainty, or as we're preparing to deal with COVID and adjusting to restrictions and moving forward through that process, getting acclimated and somewhat just dealing with sort of this new environment. And then we start to move into the later stages, which is when we move out of those restrictions and start getting back to the quote unquote more normal way of living, and eventually, hopefully, getting past COVID-19. And so we've been monitoring this over time, and each one of those stages comes with its own sets of events, environments, and emotions that consumers are dealing with. And the reason we do this is a lot of our clients are using this model or models like this to understand what their consumers are dealing with at that time. How do we communicate with them? How do we appeal to them? How do we help them with the situations that they're facing at those various stages? So as of, I think it was last week or end of November, so is when the last time we did this, what we see is predominantly everybody is in the initial stages of IPAC. We're mostly in this sort of preparation, adjustment to acclimation stage. And there's very few consumers who feel they're in the later stages. Some feel they are settling in, a small portion are rebuilding. And that may be because of the area they live in. Some of the restrictions in those particular states are maybe lifted already. But most of us are in these initial stages and having to deal with stay-at-home orders, restrictions, closed businesses, working from home, things of that nature. And again, dealing with those emotions that are tied to that. Well, if we layer those together, so again, we look at the COVID cases that are taking place or how they've sort of mapped over the time that it was first introduced until more recent. What we're seeing is that shift in stages kind of follows the same path as the number of cases that we have in the country. And there was a point in time in June where we actually were almost balanced between consumers feeling they were still in the early stages or the initial stages and those that have moved on to the later stage. It was close to a 50-50 balance. But since then, we've seen sort of a shift back. So while things have gone up and down a little bit in terms of, you know, the number of cases going down and the different states, regions adjusting to that. If you look at the most recent data, we're actually at pretty much the worst point in terms of number of people that feel they're in the initial stage. Almost 82% are saying that's where we fall. Only 16% feel they're in the later stages. And this is one of the models that we had foreseen, was that if there was a resurgence or a second outbreak of COVID, that this could happen. And in fact, that's what we're seeing. That again, we're cycling back into some of those areas where we're shutting down, we're restricting movement, we're putting more and more, I guess, distancing between us and what we would consider normal routines from the past. Now, despite the resurgence of COVID, what we're not seeing is a real shift in the amount of frustrations Americans are expressing. It's been rather consistent. So what you can see is while, it's sort of a bell-shaped curve, and there's some reference data at the bottom back in June, and again, reminding you that that's sort of when we're at our peak in terms of that IPAC model. You can see the percentages are pretty aligned. But the other thing to note really is that 2/3 of Americans are feeling frustration, right? Some level of it, whether it's what we would call more moderate or to higher levels as you kind of move to the right. So the notion that while it's been stable and consistent, it's still a very frustrating situation for consumers to be dealing with, because again, they are having to be restricted and whatnot. Another measure that we've been tracking is, what's your outlook? How are you feeling about the future? And again, while we're seeing very consistent numbers from back in June to now, where the levels pretty much for all the choices are staying relatively consistent with some minor movement for the most part, what we are noting also is that most Americans, 82%, are saying that they are feeling some level of uncertainty. So again, there is levels of frustration that we're all dealing with. There is some concern about like, when will this end, and what's that new normal that we've all sort of used that term for, what it's really going to be like. That's difficult for us. And as you're working with your customers, helping them through that process, giving them assurances, being supportive in the way you provide them your products and services is really critical for your success. So now kind of shifting this to, well, what does that mean for kind of our topic today, which is mobility? And looking at the three sort of primary categories, which is I can drive my own vehicle, I can use public transportation, or I can use ride sharing services, ride hailing services. And while all of them are down from what we had seen prior to COVID, the one that's least effective is driving your own vehicle. Now, a lot of that down is because, okay, we don't have to drive into work as often. Many of us are able to work from home. And so that has reduced the need to have transportation of any sort. But if you compare the three groups, what you really notice is that public transportation and ride sharing are down much more. In fact, half of consumers are saying they're using it much less than they were before. And so this obviously is a difficult situation to manage those services. Let's say driving your own vehicle, what the OEMs have an opportunity ahead of them potentially to take advantage of this and to support consumer needs to be able to have your own vehicle versus using something where you're mixed in with other people or other users. So another interesting thing that we thought we'd just kind of share, and again, kind of following on the same path as over that same time period, this is actually data from a group called City Mapper. And this is an app that in major cities across the world is managing or sort of tracking mobility. And this includes all forms of mobility with the exception of driving your own vehicle. So it's trains, subways, buses, even micromobility like walking, biking, scooters, things of that nature. And of course, when COVID first hit, we saw this drastic drop off. So 100% would be norm, meaning that's sort of the normal rate of usage in these cities. And in some cases, you see a peak above 100, and that's because maybe there was something going on at that time that brought more people into those cities for that period. But then we saw the stark fall off, and over time it was creeping up. But then when we saw this resurgent back in October and November, we see it falling off again, and they're at best 60, at worst 90% of their normal rates. Now, looking at buyer surveillance, which Frank had introduced to you earlier, this is what the country looks like for transit station activity. And this is based on the transit available in each individual state. So while granted, New York has many different forms of transit available, especially in cities like New York City, other states like, let's say, Montana, well, they offer less, but again, this is all based on their norm. So they have buses and maybe a few other sources. So for those reasons, you can see kind of how this balances out. So when you see the country white like this, or mostly white with a little bit of shading of maybe slight red or slight blue, that indicates that that's sort of at norm level. This is pre-COVID in February. But if you kind of forward through the year, and now all of a sudden COVID has been introduced in March, we see things shifting more red. The darker red, the more away we're shifting from the norm. If it starts to shift blue, that means we're moving back above the norms. And so if you kind of fast forward into April, this is when it was kind of full-fledged and we're starting to see the restrictions and stay-at-home orders. This is kind of at our worst, when we were most restrictive in terms of this activity at transit stations across the country. And then kind of fast forwarding to the end of summer, we actually were starting to see some of this coming out of this. So the outlook was more positive, the red was lightening, but then we see the resurgence and all of a sudden we start to see the blue go away and it's getting a little darker red. This kind of modeling, along with tracking cases and looking at customer opinion and understanding all of the feelings and issues and circumstances that consumers are dealing with, this is what we're trying to use or help our customers with all of these models understand how do they put together activities, plans to support customers, to encourage them to keep them safe and keep them using your particular services or products. So before I turn this over to John, I'm going to leave with this last measure, and we've shared this before. This is really a look at what are you planning to do when COVID's all done, whenever that is. And for driving your own vehicle, most people are saying, hey, I'm ready to jump back in and use immediately. That's okay. You know, it's a controlled environment. I know that it's safe. I'm kind of using it more now than certainly the other services. And very few people are saying, hey, I'm going to delay or even stop usage. And some of that are saying that may be because they feel, hey, I'm going to be able to continue to work from home, so I'm not going to need to drive as much. But when you look at public transportation and ride sharing services, their story is very different. There's a greater proportion of the people that are former users of these types of services that say, I'm probably going to delay my return or even stop using it altogether. In fact, that's the largest portion of each of those groups are in that category. And this stems from concerns that John's going to share with you a little bit about, is it safe? Is it what I really should be doing? And so I'm going to use that as sort of a stepping off point and then turn the conversation over to John. So John, all yours.
Mike, before you do that, so adding my little color commentary on this. So I think everybody understands the importance here is whether you use an Ipsos or you use somebody else, the fact that we really are encouraging you guys to use some type of modeling to understand how this is impacting our business. Now, each one of these areas, public transportation, okay, there's tax implications, there's congestion implications, there's a lot of revenue implications around when this starts shifting. If I'm an Uber or a Lyft, you know, it's trying to understand these curves and maybe the slope of the curves to predict where their business will pick up or maybe fall back depending upon, you know, what happens. Today in Michigan, we just got another extension of, I think, 2-3 weeks of a, you know, informal lockdown. So that's going to have some impact. From a OEM perspective, a couple of things that I would pull from this is so in those cities where you have mass transit, and we all know, and we'll talk a little bit about the fact, does that mean people are going to buy more cars? Well, they may have that mindset now. They may find out in 3 months when it takes 3 hours to get to work because everybody decided to get in cars. That's going to be a problem. But if I was an OEM and I happen to be selling in one of those markets where mass transit is common, I would definitely be looking at my incentives, not only the type of car, but getting those offers in front of them sooner than later. So again, I just think I wanted to make sure people kind of reflect on these tools, these modeling tools, and how they can help you know, again, depending upon, you know, what type of business that you're particularly in. So anyways, Mike, just wanted to add that.
No, thank you, Frank. That's a good points. All right, John, I'm going to turn it over.
Great, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
You can now, yep.
Great, well, thanks, Mike. I certainly appreciate it, and we'll get into our module results in a little bit more focus to understand some of you know, what are the elements causing people to choose these different transportation choices. And specifically, what I wanted to highlight is this module is a little different than the rest in that we have what we would call is a focus, of course, on primary vehicle owners, but we do have a subset of non-owners, so we can understand if people who don't own a vehicle, what is their perceptions and what is their assessment of utilization of these different services, so we can understand that. But we do have a primary view of vehicle owners because of understanding what's going to cause them to choose to use their vehicle versus, let's say, public transportation or ride hailing or any of these other shared services they could potentially use. But note that we do have, our base is 11 countries, have 2,000 completes across each of these countries, and then we do have what we call a representative mix of age, gender, where do they reside, and kids in household and not. But ultimately, it's a very robust sample set. to be able to allow us to dig in deeper to get into some of the key highlights of what amounts to is the service utilization and what's driving some of those choices from what Mike shared, and understanding of those. We've seen this drop, but what's causing that, and what can we potentially do about it? So from this module, a little bit further detail is, while we are talking about shared mobility and that topic, you might say, well, what does that include? What is that? You would, of course, say public transportation, ride hailing are the top ones, but there are others in this module that we have access to, such as car sharing, car subscription, just taxi utilization, micromobility, things like that. What are the usage occasion for each of these different services? So we have that as part of this module. We're not going to go into all that great detail today, but just know the richness that is from this module that you can glean. But ultimately, it's a matter of understanding of these results, understanding what we see. Another key point I want to highlight, all of this fielding was done at the end of November, so you understand the time period. So that's right when we've seen this global resurgence of the cases, and so that is in part part of our interpretation of these results. So diving right in, what are we looking at here? We just want to understand the focus of our customers. We're highlighting here in the US, so because that most of the decision makers are on this discussion today is from the US. Trying to understand is, how is paid transportation changing from 2019 versus 2020, and how has that utilization been impacted? We saw all of the actual numbers of what Mike was sharing, but this is of claimed. What are these people telling us? And so we can glean more of the understanding of what's driving that. We see the fee-based is decreased for 2020, and that's just the result of COVID, as we would expect and as we would know. But the one thing I want to highlight that's interesting is this paid services of public transportation or even ride hailing, if you will, aren't necessarily all going to another paid service. What we're seeing is an increase of usage not being done, meaning they are more apt to not do it, and that's a result of not requiring to have to go to commute into work or go to school, for that matter, right? The requirement isn't there, so that's why we see the decreased utilization. When we compare this to China, one thing that's interesting here is we know they're ahead of us as it relates to their adaptation to this new reality. We do see public transportation has dropped, but ride hailing isn't so much. So all in all is on par, but we do see that the ride hailing isn't as impacted, but some of the other shared services are, whereas, like I say, that's something to be cognitive of as we go forward, and particularly taking use cases from China certainly is beneficial. And now, if we focus in on the depth of use, and if we highlight just of public transportation versus ride hailing, we look at what is that depth of use and how is that evolving? And again, looking at 2019 to 2020, highlighting just for the US, particularly public transportation, we see that drop off again from what Mike shared. That's predominantly of people lack of commuting. We see a drop off in the daily utilization. But and then ultimately we see a shift down to a few times a week, a few times a month. So again, we would say on par, similar frequency. So we would see the utilization is on par, but there are less absolute users because of the lack of requirements. So ultimately, it's that understanding of, okay, there's those essential workers have to get to work and back, and ultimately they need a means to do that. So that's what we are seeing are the people who would be utilizing it. We did take a deeper look in particularly like major cities, urban areas, and we do see that utilization is more impacted in those metro areas as a result. So ultimately it is, again, a great ability to be able to dig into this data, to be able to cut and slice the data a number of different ways as it relates to demographics, as it relates to where they reside, as it relates to what services are they ultimately using as well. And then we wanted to take a look at understanding of what is their future interest in utilization of these different services, inclusive of the primary vehicle? And this is where we see a pretty dramatic expectation of a drop in usage. Again, comparing 2019 to 2020, again, looking at the US results, what are we seeing? We're seeing of these people, again, predominantly the vehicle owners, we're taking a look through that lens. What are we seeing? We're seeing an anticipation of a drop in public transportation and ride hailing and the car rental services. And that's a result of COVID. And in particular, we see that public transportation is going to be most impacted as a result, but then we do see is, ride hailing also as well, but there are certain groups that aren't as impacted, and that's where we would say this more urban, the younger, the Gen Y, Gen Z aren't as impacted as a result of their, willing to let's just say take risk and or just need to get there and to be able to utilize those services in particular. But the idea of what's transpiring is that we need to impact this, right? So the idea is so what? How do we move people off of this? If they are planning not to utilize these services, what do you got to do about it? And it's your different point of view depending on your, where you reside, whether you're an OEM, whether you are managing in city planning and movement of traffic with public transportation and or even of like ride hailing services. What are you trying to do to be able to shift this? And that's where we want to dig in a little bit further and understand that ultimately. And then but the one highlight is that we want to dig in deeper is how is this impacted globally? So I just showed you the US. Now I want to take a look at public transportation and ride hailing in particular, and looking at the other key regions of the world, such as China, Euro 5, Brazil, and what do we see? And in particular, we are seeing similar trends as it relates to the lack of planned utilization of these services, more impactful of public transportation than it is ride hailing, but nevertheless, we're seeing this similar trend. And then ultimately, we are seeing similar as it relates to skews of subgroups, and this idea of younger and males and even urban dwellers anticipating a decline that's greater for the public transportation than ride hailing, meaning they're more apt to utilize the ride hailing than of public transportation. But nevertheless, this is giving you some snapshot of what's transpiring as it relates to the key regions of the world. And then as we take a look into the key barriers of usage of public transportation, now I pull back and focus on the US here, and what I'm comparing of people who utilize public transportation versus those who do not use public transportation. What are those barriers to get people to take a look and to use it? And our key concern that rises to the top, as you would expect, is this idea of safety or exposure to illness. I mean, we would expect that with public transportation, which is having an inability to control your environment, if you will. But this idea of traditionally, when we look at these results, it isn't necessarily about safety. It's more about potentially convenience is what's caused people not to want to utilize these services, such as waiting, or you can only take what you can carry, or if you have to take multiple solutions, a trip duration is problematic. I mean, we do see this idea of the exposure to illness really pops. Of course, we would expect that with COVID, but nevertheless, that's something to be very cognitive of as you're trying to, I guess, position and guard against utilization. How do you increase it and how do you decrease it? And certainly being able to focus in on that would certainly be beneficial as part of your messaging. We then compare this to China, and we do see top of the list exposure to illness. Again, you would potentially expect that, but it's just more confirmational to understand, because again, if we recall, we do see a drop in public transportation utilization, and it is about that idea of exposure to illness in an uncontrolled environment. It's harder with a bigger group setting. But we also know that you can't pack in as many people in public transportation these days as you used to be able to. So that also has an impact as it relates to utilization. And then ultimately, now if we focus in on those barriers for ride hailing, what are the top of mind messages or top of mind mentions as it relates to, again, comparing ride hail users versus non-users, US focused here. What do we see? And one thing is that there's still a key barrier for ride hailing is this idea of personal security. The exposure to illness didn't leapfrog it. We still have to address as it relates to that personal security barrier, if you will, for the ride hailing. But you also want to make sure that you address as it relates to the exposure to illness. And because of that sheer importance. And then when we do year over year comparison, we do see this key point of security is top of mind for consumers. And then when we compare against China, we do see a similar phenomenon with the personal security and exposure to illness. Again, similar, they're ahead of us, but so that's more confirmational, if you will, of what's transpiring.
Hey, John, before you move on, just because a relevant question, what's your assessment of the ride hailing relative to car rental? Similar findings, any major differences? Should they be worried about, I think, more like ride hailing aspects than public transportation?
Yeah, it is. It tends to be more like the ride hailing because it is a little bit more of that controlled environment, right? Or I should say reduced number of chances, right? You think of public, there's more numbers as than with the ride hailing situation. But yes, it's more on par with that. And
yeah, I think another thing from the earlier graphs with car rental, things like that, the travel use of car rentals is down so much right now. A lot of the numbers you're seeing about usage are just related to the fact that people are not either taking vacations or business trips, which has an impact on usage. So obviously it's related to COVID, but maybe more indirectly.
That's right. That's fair. But I was just commenting as it relates to the numbers, right? Because now you have the ability to certify the cleanliness of that vehicle, and you're the only one going into it, right? So those kinds of things gives you a little bit of safe haven, if you will, or a little bit of confirmational confidence that what you're getting into is clean relative to an uncertainty of like a subway or and where I am in California, the BART train, so.
Sure. Well, thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, no problem. So then I want to do a quick little synopsis for you to some comparison as it relates to that public transportation user versus a non-user. We have some demographic profiling as well as some attitudes. And what are we seeing? And in particular with the public transportation user, they're more likely to be in a metropolitan area. They're less likely to own a home, and they need to get to work. This idea of essential work, 34%. Work from home or unemployed. So it's a smaller number relative to that non-user. And then the other aspect of this perception of access to transportation, that's a key point for them. They want to have good access to public transportation in order to utilize it. And then, waiting isn't as important than the non-user. So perhaps it's this idea of the budget, I'm willing to wait because I don't have to pay as much, right? So it is a more shared type of service. And then if we look at the profile, the ride hailing user, it's slightly different. They tend to be a little bit younger. They're not as required to, need to get to work as much. They have a higher home ownership percentage than those public transportation users. And there's just a more urgent focus of time and a lack of hassle. This idea of they're not as willing to wait for their trip for travel, right? They're more not wanting to also have to deal with call it the lack of convenience or the hassle idea of parking, right? That's why the ride hailing is, selected into the more degree. So from that perspective is a slightly different perception, slightly different profile, demographic profile, who they are. Then we took a look and we want to take a step back and say, okay, what's going to cause people to be interested in transportation? Specifically. And we really wanted to focus and we take a look at, just the vehicle owners versus the public transportation users versus the ride hailing users. And what is thrusted to the top for people? And so regardless of this mode of transportation, the key priority to them is safety, its reliability, and availability. This is what pops up as the top three across the different user groups. And of course, we would expect that as it relates to COVID. So this one thing, though, that isn't necessarily at the top mentioned is this idea of cleanliness, right? That isn't the main driver that's going to be top of mind. They more or less expect that, right? This idea of safety, they want to be protected, is going to be more important to them. We also took a look at doing a little bit deeper evaluation here. This is all stated for our global report. We did some, what do we call, a little bit more sophisticated analysis, a driver analysis, and we're able to reveal what's really motivating people to get into these different types of transportation options. And just as a little preview, if you will, for our subscribers, is this idea of convenience is the key driver for ride hailing, right? Is this idea of having hands-free, the ability to connect and stay connected with your device, having some fun because you're not having the responsibility of driving. That's what's key about that. And perhaps you know that, perhaps that's confirmational, but that's needless to say, that is still revealed in our data that even though they may be taking a risk, if you will, going into a vehicle of uncertainty as it relates to the cleanliness, that is still a key driver for them. But as it relates to the top of mind mentions, the one thing I want to highlight, again, I did touch on this idea of the cleanliness already, but just that knowing that this combination of cleanliness and price is something to offset. So cost is going to become more of an important dimension for both public transportation users than ride hailing versus necessarily cleanliness. Of course, we don't want to have a dirty subway train or ride hailing vehicle, but being aware of that balance is key. There is an element of expectation that it's going to be, like I say, not, grimy, if you will, but nevertheless, it's something to be aware of. And then when we did look at, we do see slight differences between, say, the younger versus the older, this idea of even country, there's some differences. And then this idea of, when I say location, this idea of what city do they live in? Are they in a major city or in the suburbs? And there's some slight skew. So again, a lot of different opportunity to profile and target with our data set. We also asked okay, what are some of the key features that are going to cause people to be more likely to utilize these shared mobility services? And again, looking at these key user groups of vehicle owners, public transportation users, and the ride-hailing users, what comes to the top of mind? And we do see is, regardless of this, again, user type, this additional protection is useful. Granted, we can't ignore, what's happening in the market, right? I mean, we see it on the news every day. We just get thrusted about COVID news. I think we probably have too much news about it, but it is still important. It's something that has to be addressed. And having visible signs that you're doing something about it is going to be advantageous. And so this idea of having hand sanitizer, disinfecting wipes being available at your disposal, if you will, is certainly more confirmational. I know I've experienced, you go into the grocery store and you got a wipe to wipe down the cart, you got a little hand sanitizer there just to help confirm that for you that you would be taken care of, even though it's probably not necessary, but it is something to have that visual confirmation is beneficial. And then we see the rank order changes a little bit for most, and this isn't a typo for you down there on the vehicle owners. We have it says air quality monitoring is the 7th. Mask comes up as the 6th item for vehicle owners, but then it's the 7th, if you will, for the others. So mask is certainly part of the mix, but it's more confirmational seeing these other things because this idea is you're already wearing a mask, right? Likely. So therefore, that's why it's not as top of mind versus these other elements. But nevertheless, good insight there. And then as we look at the different SKUs, we do see slight differences based off of gender, age, and residence. So again, we see slight shifts, but it is something to be mindful that regardless of those demographic shifts, those user type, where you're coming from, having these as the confirmational that you're taking care of it are the ones that are most important that's again the hand sanitizer and the disinfecting wipes. Then change things a little bit for you is that we asked a quick question just to say, hey, what are the top 5 companies that you would expect of future mobility over the next 5 years? We presented over 35 different companies across the industry as it relates to OEMs, to service providers, to tech providers, and just asked them, what is their interest? Who would float to the top as being a provider of future mobility solutions? And specifically, what did we learn? One thing that was quite interesting to us, again, looking at those same user groups of owners, the public transportation users, and the ride-hailing users, what came to, what did we reveal? Uber is that top company of the future mobility solutions, but surprisingly, we are seeing is that Amazon comes to the top. We do see this, of course, differs to some degree on demos as well as by different countries, but Amazon is up there. And why would that be? And the one thing I will say during this pandemic, I know in my neighborhood I see a lot of Amazon trucks, right? I'm doing those deliveries, and so they've branched out and expanded their footprint from a visibility standpoint and can be providing this so they have some credibility. We've seen this in some of our other modules as it relates to future electrification providers. And we do see tech providers pop up in there. We do see forward-thinking companies that pop up. And this idea is you get credit, even though you may not be offering a solution in that space, you have credibility in that space. And that's what we're seeing as it relates to Amazon in particular. But nevertheless, we just thought that was a little interesting factoid to share. With that, I would want to highlight a couple of key takeaways and recommendations, and we'll get through these fairly quickly. On the most part, we would say consumers, they're just not ready to use the share-based services just yet to the levels prior to COVID. However, we would say there is some opportunity with some additional support on how to offset that. We also know, I'm going to say the elephant in the room is this idea of this future vaccine and the timing of that. That is to be determined. That's certainly going to be beneficial to help people's mindset, particularly as it relates to their confidence of the transportation choices that they would have. We also see what's interesting is that even though the cases are up extremely versus what we were in April, our frustration level isn't any greater. And that's an indication of our confidence, our education, understanding what do we got to do. So that certainly is beneficial, even though even though the cases are up, we know how to deal with it. Also, we've seen is that consumers adapted to this current reality. We are seeing people are using their vehicle more. And so I know Frank commented earlier is this idea of could potentially capitalize on it. The OEMs can capitalize on that opportunity, but it is something to be mindful of because of the inherent risks associated with the public transportation and or ride hailing in the mindset of that consumer, even though those risks may not be absolute. The other thing we've seen is this idea of there are, the key barriers for people as it relates to the share services. It's preventing of an illness, cleanliness pops at the top, personal securities for the ride hailing. It's a matter of making sure that we're, addressing that communication through your messaging so that you can offset some of those key top of mind barriers for those users. And then specifically would say safety is key. It's a matter of still communicating safety and having that as a key platform of messaging for a personal vehicle. This idea of physical crash prevention is key, but you also have a safe haven inside the vehicle, right? As it relates to you have the control. The public transportation, it's about prevention of illness and cleanliness, and then ride hailing is personal security, and again, prevention of illness. Slight tweaks of each, but just being mindful of that. And then this idea of an opportunity to add protection, what could you do to offset it? Visible signs, hand sanitizer, wipes, disposable wipes, things like this can help prevent and confirm that you have a clean transportation. So one thing we're doing a little different on this is this idea is because of the different, I guess you could say transportation type of, depends on where you're coming from, we have some recommendations of what you should do. So again, from an OEM, it's about messaging that you can provide a safe and controlled environment with a clear benefit. That's a key emphasis point to help increase the, I guess, adoption of accelerating a purchase, replacing of a purchase, or getting into a vehicle that they may not have had otherwise. That is certainly going to be advantageous for those people who are concerned. Again, leveraging, understanding what are the underlying motivations, leveraging our IPAC model can help with that interpretation. Again, we can provide that as part of the full subscription of the Navigator. Public transportation, a little different, right? It's this idea of having signs of what's happening, what they're doing to be confirmational of precautions. This idea of signage, this idea of clean, it's clean, it's disinfected, perhaps overnight, hand sanitizer, disinfecting wipes, things like this. And with ride hailing, what are the precautions you're doing between rides? What are you ensuring that that vehicle is clean? Having that messaging within app as well as within commercials, as I've seen, that is certainly the right thing. And then ultimately even having the sanitizer and wipes in the vehicle would be advantageous as well, as we've learned from our data. And these are just a couple of ones that we have. There's others. And I don't know, Frank or Mike, if you want to add anything further on this, but I know there's different angles you could take with this for sure.
Well, okay, Frank. So to me, again, most of the people on the phone here are from consumer insights groups, and you have a lot of data, your own data and syndicated data and so on, data like this is really the I mean, this is when we really need to step up as analysts and try to help the marketing people and the brand people get the right message at the right time. So I really implore the audience to kind of look at the data maybe a little bit differently, and use all the resources. I never thought I would be using GPS data to try to understand traffic flow at a dealership and the implications of a surge in COVID, but it does allow us to help our clients get in front of it and like, okay, we got a problem coming. We need to be aware of how do we get in front of it. So, for me, a message is it is very different between each one of these. And we talked about car and all other types of businesses. And it's going to change. I mean, I mentioned a little earlier about John and I were talking about, oh my goodness, if people do start buying more cars and just won't get on the subway and they think they're just going to get in their little car and they're going to go, first of all, they're going to not find parking spaces. It's going to take them a lot longer to get in. And are they going to be scratching their head a couple months later saying, whoops, maybe I shouldn't have bought that car. So now would be the time to pounce on that if they're not even thinking about that now. So those are some of the things I guess I would challenge the audience and us to help figure out those answers.
Good. Great. Thanks, Mike. All right, sorry. Thanks, Frank. Sorry about that. But no, it's definitely beneficial. And so, Mike, I don't know if you had any further comments you would want to add on this.
No, I think Frank covered it well. Each of these different groups have different potential strategies to either retain customers, to try to attract new customers, and even looking at consideration as to how do we manage each of those. Do OEMs start developing more small vehicles to help support the lack of maybe parking and the congestion? Is that now a new emerging opportunity in the United States, where traditionally our cars have been larger and we just keep getting them bigger and bigger? So that's also a wrinkle to consider. And then with public transportation, certainly looking at, do we start to manage how many people we allow into a particular train or bus at a time? Does that mean we have to offer more trains running through or buses running through? So all of these considerations to try to make it acceptable, make it accessible, and take advantage of the current time, understanding those emotions and those issues that consumers are dealing with. And a model like IPAC, looking at the different scenarios, resurgence versus continuation versus calming, looking at those different scenarios and having contingencies on how we'll deal and help customers along those paths. I would encourage, as Frank's been encouraging as well, to use these types of tools to help project forward and help you market to your customers accordingly.
Yep. All right, thanks.
Very good.
I'll just close. And again, I wanted to thank, not only John and Mike for putting this together, but those of you who've been through the presentations from all the way back in March and May when we started it. A lot of you had budgets, froze, and it's been a tough year for all of us, but just having the opportunity to get some of this data in front of you. So we really, again, appreciate you guys participating. And again, if you have any questions, you can call any one of us, or maybe you have a certain account manager that you work with. But anyway, we can help, please call. So again, thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. That now concludes today's webinar, and do be on the lookout for an email with a link to today's recorded presentation. Have a wonderful day.